I always look at it this, and usually when I talk to different farm groups, I've never met a farmer that wasn't passionate about food, right? Like, think of the industry that you're in, and this is all about feeding people, providing what they need to grow not only themselves but their families. It's such a prideful industry, and farmers and ranchers are full of pride as well for what they do.
Welcome to the Swine Canada podcast show, brought to you by Wisenetics. We are dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the Canadian pork industry. So I'm Miranda Smith, and I'll be the host for today's episode. And today's guest is Clinton Monchuk, who is the Executive Director of Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan. So today we'll have a discussion about consumer perspectives when it comes to the food industry. But first, let's get started with a little bit of an introduction. So, Clinton, can you tell us a bit about your background, and can you tell us a little bit about what Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan is and does?
Sure, I think we could probably cover a whole podcast talking about my background, but I actually grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan, and so my great grandfather homesteaded in that area back in 1906. So our family's been farming in the area for well over 100 years. And my brother and I have now taken over the grain farm. But we had a dairy farm growing up, so I'm used to animal agriculture. We had dairy, we had beef. We had a layer operation up until this last year as well, so familiar with the poultry industry, and married into a ranching family down in Oklahoma. So we now have a part of Oklahoma Ranch. So, but my background, I've always been in agriculture. I absolutely love it. My undergraduate was at the University of Saskatchewan in agricultural economics. My master's was at the University of Guelph in Ontario in agribusiness. And I've traveled throughout North America. I had a job in Washington, D.C. I'm actually an ex-lobbyist. So I worked there and in Ottawa for a time. I also had a little bit of a stint down at the Universidad de Guadalajara, so the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, and did some research and some teaching down there. So you name it, I pretty much have done it in agriculture, and I absolutely love it. My family's been so involved in agriculture. I can't imagine myself in any other industry, and so I think that's what led me to my kind of dream job, which is here with Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan. So really what we do and what our focus is to really make sure, just a quick one liner, we want to make sure consumers are more food literate. And that has a lot of different prongs about it. I'm sure we're going to talk about some of those, but really we can see the writing on the wall that consumers are getting more and more removed from agriculture. And just to give a little bit of a background on that, when I went to the University of Guelph, so it was in the early 2000s, so that's how old I am. I'm old. Back in that day, when I'd go into downtown Toronto to go watch a hockey game or whatever we would do downtown, there were legitimately farmers' fields on the 401 in between Guelph and Ontario. And just in the last few years, I've taken that drive, and they are pretty few and far between. It's a lot of that countryside is being gobbled up by commercial and residential constructions, and I get it, right? These big cities are growing, but as a result of that, there's no longer that interaction that we once had. So you're becoming generations upon generations that have never actually talked to a farmer or a rancher in their life. So then they got questions, right? And you know as well as I know, when you go to the internet, you might get the right answer, you might not. You have special interest groups out there, right? So we are all about making sure that consumers have a truthful, trustworthy source of information. And we have a lot of different engagement things that we do within Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan. So really, and this is where the Sask pork and the pork industry and in general, I think can benefit, because we're generic in nature. So we don't say, you have to eat animal protein or plant protein or whatever. We just want to make sure they understand how all our food is being raised and let consumers pick what they want to choose in their own diets. But again, we want to make sure they have the facts behind it.
Yeah, and that is so important these days because, like you say, like there's a lot of information out there on the internet, but it's not always clear who it's coming from and if it's based on truth or not. So can you explain a little bit like some of the specific things that you do with Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan?
Sure. So as the name kind of says, we're based in Saskatchewan. So we do have some engagement opportunities within the province of Saskatchewan. We do farm tours. Actually, one of our big events that we started up last year, and we knew from a lot of our analytical kind of pre and post tours that we've done, that when you give people the opportunity to actually go on farm and talk to a farmer or a rancher, not only does their level of trust goes up, they value and feel more pride in the Canadian farming and ranching system. So we thought, okay, if we're doing some of these tours with different food influencer groups, those would be, chefs or dietitian or bloggers, if we could widen this out to all of Saskatchewan and open up Saskatchewan farms and ranches, we would have Saskatchewan people take more interest in this and feel more pride. So we started that last year. We had about 3,000 urbanites that went out to farms and ranches and different venues throughout the province. And really, at the end of the day, we had the analytics and the questioning to ask them how they enjoyed it. And the vast majority, actually 94%, said they had a good to an excellent time. And 90% of them said they learned more about Saskatchewan agriculture. And that's a huge win. That's what we want. We want more a comfortable and confident urban population. So that's one of the things we do. But we also know that we need to move outside of our borders. And I know, talking to the people in the hog industry, all the hogs we grow here can't be consumed by all the Saskatchewan residents. So we got to look outside our borders. And really, the board of directors with Farm and Food Care saw that and said, we have to increase public trust on a national scale. So the individuals in Ottawa who are making our policy decisions understand why we have to house hogs in barns and not let them free run outside with predators and the elements of the weather and whatnot. So as a result of that, we started an online initiative called Canadian Food Focus. And it started back in 2019, and it really has gone gangbusters. Now, every month we have engagements. So when I'm saying engagements, I mean people who are actually watching videos, liking, sharing, commenting on any of our social media posts, or looking at our newsletter, or coming online to see different articles and recipes that we have. We're around 800,000 a month of
Wow.
engagements. And it really has just shifted, because we do a really good job of talking to ourselves. Like, if I talk to another farmer, I can talk to them for hours about what they do, but that's not who we need to target. We need to target people in downtown Toronto or Montreal. It's also in French, so, or Vancouver, and we finally broke through that barrier. And I think the industry is now looking at this and saying, it's a third party kind of resource. It's getting that feedback, and we want to be part of this now. So it's a great initiative, and anybody listening who's interested, feel free to contact us to take part in some of our stuff.
Excellent. Perfect. And like you mentioned a little bit earlier, trust. So trust is a big thing. And it sounds like there's a bit of a decreasing trust in consumers when it comes to their food. So can you talk a little bit about why you think that is happening and how we can maybe turn that around?
Yeah, so the biggest issue, and the Canadian Center for Food Integrity every year kind of has this just one question: do you trust the food system? And ironically enough, the highest level of trust that we've saw in the last, I guess, 10 years or so was right around COVID. And a lot of people think, well, come on, really? it seems odd that that was the case. But if you think about it, and I lecture sometimes at the University of Saskatchewan, and I ask the students this, like, why do you think this was the case? And a lot of people said, well, we ran out of food. And I said, but did we run out of food? We were in the first pandemic in 100 years, and we have advanced everything. Nobody went hungry in this country. Food systems had to change, but we still provided. We ran out of toilet paper, right? But we
Yes.
still had food. And albeit it wasn't, you might have been looking for, say, chocolate milk and pork loins one day, and you might not have got both of those things, right? But you still had food. And I think that is what fundamentally shifted the view and the perception of consumers during that period of time. Now, what happened after that, though, was where trust started to tank. And what happened was, as we kind of fed through the system the issues with food inflation. So, and as a grain farmer, I remember, especially when the war broke out in Ukraine, the price of fertilizer went absolutely through the roof. In fact, I was paying double for my fertilizer on my grain farm. Um, and that fed through the system, and all of a sudden the price of food was going up. And even today, you look at both the Canadian and American elections, the Canadian one that will be coming up, and food inflation is definitely still a key topic of discussion with both sides of the border. And a lot of that is just that you know old effects of COVID, wars, all these things kind of feeding through the system, and we're dealing with it now. It's trying to flatten out, but consumers see that pinch at the grocery store every week. And when they were used, and even myself, if I'm used to, say, paying $200 every week for my groceries for a family of four, and I do half of the grocery shopping, so it used to be around $200, and now I'm pushing 240 to 250, right? So I don't feel I'm buying anything different or different, quality or higher end brands. It's pretty much the same, but that's the reality. So if you see that every week, it weighs on you. And when consumers are asked, like, what's the number one concern you have in your life, it's the price of food. And which is weird, because you could pick healthcare, you could pick energy, you could pick politics, whatever it is, but food, the price of food is the number one concern amongst Canadian consumers, because they see it every day. So as a result of that, the overall level of trust has kind of weakened over the years. So if you go from 2020 to 2024, it's dropped probably about 5 to 7%, depending on which year and some of the different parameters you use. So it is a drop in that level of trust, because people feel something's happening. They don't understand why. They kind of have a good idea that farmers aren't trying to gouge consumers. But then the question is, well, who is gouging me, right? Is it Galen Weston? Is it Tyson Pork in the US? Like, who is it? Who's doing this? But the reality is, it's just everything keeps on going up in price. You can pick and choose different things. A carbon tax wasn't helpful, right? Because that increased the transportation costs on all our food, the wars that are going on, all these different things that are kind of accumulating to where we are today. And like I said, you have politicians saying they're going to do something great for this, and we're going to decrease the food inflation. And I can tell you, 25% tariffs coming from Canada into the United States is not going to help anybody on either side of the border when it comes to food inflation. So,
No, very
mind you,
true.
that's my economist brain speaking too. So maybe some of these politicians have some different economic theory that I'm not familiar with.
It's unfortunate, though, that these are all these kinds of like outside influences that are affecting people's trust in our food system. But at the farm level, we haven't really changed things. And it's also not that farmers make a lot of money. Like, if only that was the case, right? But like, even though the food prices have gone up, the prices of like pork has not gone up that much for the producers. So, but like at the same time, producers are trying to implement like improvements in like welfare, in like other types of best management practices. So, how can we then increase the trust in our food system? Because we cannot really change all those outside factors.
No, and I think you're right. And as a farmer, especially in livestock farming, I feel there's a pile on effect, right? So you're ever changing to try and ensure that you have the confidence of the consumer, right? So you think of all the food safety programs or animal care programs you have to abide. And I'm starting to see them a lot more on the grain side of thing too, for responsible use of pesticides and responsible um, recycling of all my containers and things like this. So you can see that we are moving in a good direction, right? Like there are benefits to all these different practices we're doing, but it's not always known by consumers, and that is the issue, right? So if you and let's take confined agriculture for an example. For whatever reason, there is the viewpoint amongst consumers that if that animal can see the sunrise and the sunset, that must be better. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you explain to them, okay, I live in Saskatchewan. It's freaking cold here for about, well, I used to say 4 months out of the year, but my wife's from Oklahoma, and she
Six.
says it's about 6 months out of the year. But okay, so you got 4 months. I guarantee you give the option on a day like today in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where it's windy, it's cold, not one animal will ever choose to go outside. Like it's not in their best interest. That's why we've created these structures to do this, right? That's why we have ventilation systems. We have self-feeding systems, all these different things for animal comfort indoors where the temperature is always going to be at, say, 21, 22 degrees Celsius, right? So when you try to explain to a consumer that and you have them on your farm, and I know we did this a lot when we had our layer operation. When you explain to them, they are absolutely happy in the barn. They don't want to go outside. And the reason you even simulate a day, sunrise, sunset with the lighting system. And I know that's same with all of animal agriculture. So there's not a lot of different, but you're protecting them from the elements outside. You're protecting them from predators. And you know what, if you choose to be, for example, an organic farmer, and you that is one of the requirements, that you have to offer them the ability to be outside, then even at that, the consumer has a choice to choose that. That's great, but we need to make sure they understand the facts around that, and the reasons why we do that. So I think that's where that level of engagement has to take place. And we want to make sure farmers are speaking more about what they do. And that's,
Hmm.
almost one conversation at a time. But for example, Canadian Food Focus, we want to hit even more people at a time by having multiple different resources people can use, or videos, or like we had talked about before, recipes. And it's interesting. So if you think of recipes, and I want to explain this, when we hired a marketing company out of Montreal to figure out how we could break this barrier of getting outside of the agriculture bubble, we hired somebody that wasn't in agriculture. They were just a marketing company from downtown Montreal. And their comment was, you're going about this the entirely wrong way. You're trying to put farmer talk in the hands of consumers. Consumers don't understand farmer talk, and you got to stop that nonsense. You got to talk food. So when you talk food, you bring people in. So when you talk recipes, when you talk nutrition, when you talk what can I feed my child at 6 months old, and all these different things that people actually do Google searches for, they come to our site. And then when they're interested in understanding, the benefits or the protein in pork, then that links to how pork is being produced in Canada. And that's where the engagement and the learning takes place. And because you have them in already because they're interested in food, and then it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to tweak your curiosity, and this is some more information around pork, and oh yeah, here's a hog farmer. So those are the engagement things, and that's when I think we can then talk about our food safety programs, animal care programs, so they're more knowledgeable about what production actually happens and why we do what we do.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense because when you think about it, food is what brings people together. It's part of culture. It's part of our health. So it takes a big place in our lives, right? So it makes sense to bring people in through food, and then they'll start asking questions like, okay, so where is my food coming from, and were the animals raised in with a good welfare, good care? So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Um, so you mentioned food and recipes. Do you have some specific recipes with pork in it, on your website, or do you have any that you have yourself that you really like?
So I always say yes, there's definitely recipes with pork on the website, and CanadianFoodFocus.org is the website, and just click under the recipes, and we do have different dietitians that have articles talking about different foods on there as well. But I always like to say, and full disclosure, a good chunk of my family is in the hog industry. So I do have a very soft spot for pork, but my favorite has to be bacon. Anything with bacon is the number one. In fact, um, I, I think before I married my wife, she actually made the comment. She said, I don't know if I've ever, purchased as much bacon as I had in my entire life until, I met you. And I just love bacon. So everything is definitely better with bacon. So
Definitely. Okay, so I want to go back to something else you were saying, which is bringing people onto the farm, and then that really helps in creating that trust and understanding of why we're doing the things we're doing. Now, of course, when it comes to pig farms, we have very high biosecurity, and for that reason it's hard to bring people into our farms. So what would you recommend to hog producers in that case? Because it's hard for us to say oh, just come in and have a look for yourself.
yeah, this is where uh, technology comes into play very easily, and I've had to do it too, in the past, in our poultry barn, where um, you take your camera and you can do a live feed from within your barn. I guess it depends on how thick the walls are with concrete. I know sometimes when you get to certain edges of the barn, the cell coverage or the Wi-Fi might be not the greatest. But I think when you do some of those videos, you're showing, those individuals. It doesn't have to be, in person, physically, one-on-one, but that can happen too. And I know I went to the Prairie Swine Center a little while back, and I brought in, there were 3 director generals from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and they really wanted to go in the inside of a barn. And I do appreciate the Prairie Swine Center for allowing us to do this, because it fundamentally changed their views around hog production. They got to see the inside of a barn, and see how hogs were cared for, and some of the different trials that were going on. And it did help them for what they had to do in their careers, which was really, all 3 of them were looking at preparedness for African swine fever. So to have that background really helps them in their policymaking, and truly that's what we want. So in absence of doing that, I highly consider taking the odd video and either posting it on social media. The other thing is, there's great opportunities to connect with grade school kids. And in the month of March, Agriculture in the Classroom across Canada has what's called Agriculture Literacy Month. And always participate in that in the city of Saskatoon, and usually go to 3 or 4 different schools. But what I do is I obviously I can't take them all into my combine or in the inside of a chicken barn or anything, but I can take videos. I upload them onto YouTube and then I show them in the classroom. And they love it. They absolutely love it. And we have conversations about why we do the things we do. And I think that is the opportunity for hog farmers throughout the country is to take some of those videos and find those opportunities where you can actually share that, because that you know grade school kid is going to likely tell their mom or their dad what they experienced that day, right? And then they have a little bit more information to talk to them, and I think that's where the learning, that's where the engagement, and that's where the trust builds.
So do you also have specific like resources for teachers? Because obviously you're only one person, so you cannot go to every single classroom
Yeah.
in Saskatoon or even the province or Canada. So do you have like specific training for teachers or anything like that?
So that's where we do a lot of partnering with agriculture in the classroom. So our focus is really on food purchasers, the people who are making the decisions about food. So it's usually kids that are adults and older. I guess
Hmm.
adults are older, but people that are outside of high school. But we do partner with Egg in the Classroom. So, for example, we have what's called the Real Dirt on Farming. We put it out once every 3 or 4 years. And it kind of gives a whole bunch of facts for all the different sectors of agriculture. But within that, we now make a teacher resource book. So it actually identifies if you're a grade 4 teacher and you're in science, here are some of the things that you can talk about, and they're backed up by the Real Dirt on Farming. So there's that exists for them. The other thing that we do, and this is primarily we get the biggest kind of interest from kids, grade school kids, but there's a lot of adults that are interested in this too, which is our Farm Food 360. So we have 360-degree farm tours that people can actually take, and you can go to farmfood360.ca and you can download absolutely any farm. There's hog farms, there's grain farms, there's dairy farms. And we found during COVID, there was, in the matter of about a month, we had 1 million visits to that site because all these parents were trying to teach their kids about food, and we advertised the heck out of it and became one of the number one resources that parents were using to teach their kids about food, which was great, right? Because we then now know that these are actual legitimate Canadian farms, and you have that direct influence. So yes, so we do partner, but we try to make sure agriculture in the classroom is really the primary source for teachers' resources.
That makes sense. Okay. So is there anything else that you would like to talk about today when it comes to consumer perspectives or anything else?
Oh, I could talk for hours about this. I don't know, Miranda, if you want me to keep on talking, but we, you know what? There's just, I always look at it this, and usually when I talk to different farm groups, I've never met a farmer that wasn't passionate about food, right? Like, think of the industry that you're in, and this is all about feeding people, providing what they need to grow not only themselves but their families. It's such a prideful industry, and farmers and ranchers are full of pride as well for what they do. And typically what happens is we get a little gun shy talking about what we're doing to that person who's sitting beside us on the plane or in a community event. And I'll give you an example. So my son plays some higher level baseball, and I've chatted with different parents all over Canada and the United States when he's been playing. And one of the things that always comes up when I'm sitting beside somebody is, oh, you're a farmer. And okay, so what do you do? And so I talk to them about some of the different practices we do. And they could be, somebody from Saskatoon who's very rarely been on a farm, or somebody from Chicago who's never even talked to a farmer. But those are some of those opportunities that you have to just engage. And I think a lot of those conversations just come so naturally, but we shy away from it sometimes when we think, okay, this is a consumer that's never been to a farm. They don't understand farmers. I don't want to talk about this because I'm a little uncomfortable. But I think I just encourage everybody who's listening to just take that first step, or if you're worried or you want more resources, we actually have a workshop online called Speak Up Training where you can just kind of work through some different modules and feel more comfortable talking to consumers. Absolutely free on our website, farmfoodcaresk.org. But I think if we all do this, if we all do our part, you're just incrementally building that level of trust with Canadians.
Yeah, and that's a very good resource. And you're very right. Like I remember, I saw a friend of mine post something about agriculture on Facebook that was completely incorrect, and so I just replied with a comment explaining the way it was, and then she was like, "Oh, okay." So
Yeah.
sometimes it's as easy as that.
Yeah.
But it can also be scary because like there can be other people that are, that don't believe that the like animals should be eaten, and so they're very strict in their thoughts, and so then they climb all over you, and then you get the keyboard warriors, and things can
Trolls.
things can spiral out of control quickly.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's usually in my social media and in what we practice anyways with farm and food care and Canadian food focus is if there's a legitimate question there, 100% we're going to answer it. But if you're
Yeah.
going to be a troll, if you fundamentally don't agree with consumption of animal proteins, well, nothing I'm going to say is going to change your mind. And really that's fine. There's a certain portion of the population that's that way, but don't spread misinformation about the industry. And I know we're out of time, but and I told you I
No,
could
we
talk forever. But I'll give you an example of this. So we had a group of young professionals that was out in Saskatoon, and they wanted to do a tour. And so it was myself and a good friend of mine, Ryder Lee, who's now the general manager of the Canadian Cattle Association in Calgary. He was with me, and we went to the Poundmaker feedlot. So I'm on the board of directors with Poundmaker. It's really close to our farm, huge feedlot. Okay, so they finish out tens of thousands of feeder cattle every year. Now, after we were done, and we were very open talking about, death loss rates and how the cowboys and cowgirls tried to treat the animals and take them into the hospital, all these things, talked about antibiotics, vaccines, feed. When we got back, one of the ladies on the bus, she was kind of hesitant, but she came off the bus and she said, I really have to thank you for this. And we were like, okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks for having me. And she said, no, I don't think you understand. I'm a vegan. And I said, okay, that's fine. I like my steaks. So that's okay. And she said, no, but I don't think you understand. It was a tough thing for me to get on the bus this morning and go out because I had viewpoints in my mind of how the cattle industry treated cattle based on videos that I'd seen. And I realized at the end of this tour, talking to all the different cowboys we talked to and the people in the industry, your level of care for the animals is actually what I want for the level of care in the animals. The only difference is you're going to eat that protein and I'm not. And she said, you actually changed my view on this. And I feel obligated now to go back to some of my friends and tell them what I've witnessed. And I thought to myself afterwards, you know what? That was one individual, but Ryder and I had that opportunity to speak just in a broad sense with all these different people who were professionals from across the country. And it hit her probably the hardest because she now had a differing view on animal agriculture and it changed her perspective. And I thought that is a huge win in what we're doing. And it's kind of one of those things I think about whenever we do tours or whenever I talk to different people within the industry, that those are those wins that we need in agriculture to make sure, even if somebody it'd be great if she had a cheeseburger that evening, but she wasn't going to, right? So a cheeseburger with bacon, by the way. But she wasn't going to, and that's fine. But now she's also not going to be spreading misinformation. So that's even better in my mind in terms of trying to stop some of that disinformation.
Oh yeah, because like there is so much of that, and that kind of changes the perspective of other consumers. So yes, stopping the mis and disinformation is a big one. So I'm very grateful for what you do at Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan to make sure that the story of farmers and food goes out to our consumers. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much.
It's time for our famous three.
Yeah, so with that, we'll wrap it up. So we usually end it with three more general questions. So the first one would be like, what is your favorite food or consumer perspective related book or resource?
You know what? And it's I guess self-fulfilling, but I was one of the endorsers of a book called Food Bullying by Michelle Payne out of Indiana. She wrote it a few years back, and I was one of the editors for it. But it really it's interesting because it goes through a lot of what we just talked about in this podcast. So I would recommend actually that book, Food Bullying by Michelle Payne.
Okay, sounds interesting. I'll look it up. Thank you. And do you have another book or resource like outside of like the food or agriculture that you really enjoy?
I have so many. It's so I'm all about those I guess you could say soft books like the emotional intelligence and self-help and all those different things. I spend a lot of time by myself in tractors and combines and driving out to my farm. So I have a lot of those different books, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but yeah, a lot of those kind of softer kind of things that make you feel better about yourself, or things that you can self-improve on, I guess you could say.
Sounds good. And then the last one, in your opinion, what sets successful professionals apart from those that are not?
So this is interesting because I just chatted. I'm part of a mentorship program at the University of Saskatchewan, and I was talking to my mentee about this. And I feel, especially now more than ever, communications is setting people apart. With all the onset of social media and people not actually picking up the phone to talk to each other or physically meeting with each other, I feel like it's going to be a very high priority attribute of professionals going forward. I think of any high level professional I've met in the last 10 years, and they are strategic and effective communicators. And I think that is one of the things that will set people apart in the future, especially with all this new AI and social media stuff that's taking place. So communications, I think, is key.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Like, it was a very interesting conversation. So that concludes another episode of the Swine Canada podcast show presented by Wisenetics. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay updated on future episodes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review because your feedback is invaluable to us. So until next time, this is Miranda Smith from the Swine Canada podcast show signing off.